When we first started, there were a whole host of big cultural institutions, mainly in London, but across the UK, being sponsored by BP. So places like Tate, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Portrait Gallery, the Royal Opera House and the British Museum. And then also the National Theatre, South Bank Centre, British Film Institute, all being sponsored by Shell. And fast forward, nearly all of those cultural institutions have now had those partnerships come to an end because of activism, because of artists speaking out. My name is Garrard. I'm the co-director of an organisation called Unstained in the UK, and we campaign to end fossil fuel sponsorship of art and cultural institutions. So my background was in music. I was studying music, and I started becoming interested in climate and climate justice, and through doing that I met and made some friends, and we were concerned about companies like BP and Shell sponsoring theatre. I would go to concerts because I was studying music, and this was the Shell Classic International Concert Series, and it just didn't feel right given what I knew about Shell, what I knew about what it was doing to the environment in places like the Niger Delta, but also to the climate. And for my friends, they would go to the Royal Shakespeare Company, same problem. You go in, you open the programme, there's a big advert for BP because they're sponsoring the play. So we started doing all these kind of creative forms of activism, using theatre, getting up on stage and performing little kind of pieces of Shakespeare to highlight the problems with BP sponsoring the arts. And I started a choir that did the same thing. We would go and sing songs in the concert hall about the problems with Shell sponsoring music. So there was all this amazing creative activism happening, and then my friend Jess, she said to me, do you want to start an organisation? Because there's other things that need to happen. We need to get people who work in art and culture and in these spaces to come on board, and we need to kind of explain to people and communicate what really lies behind these sponsorship deals. Why are they so problematic? Why are they a problem? So that's how we came up with Culture Unstained. That's where the organisation was born from, and that was over 10 years ago now. When we first started, there were a whole host of big cultural institutions, mainly in London, but across the UK, being sponsored by BP. So places like Tate, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Portrait Gallery, the Royal Opera House and the British Museum. And then also the National Theatre, South Bank Centre, British Film Institute, all being sponsored by Shell. And fast forward, nearly all of those cultural institutions have now had those partnerships come to an end because of activism, because of artists speaking out, because of the investigations that we've done and kind of published and put into the media. But there are some that are still hanging on. So the British Museum is still partnering with BP, and our Science Museum is still partnering with BP, and also the Indian coal company Adani as well. But otherwise there's been this huge kind of shift in the UK cultural scene around sponsorship. So it's changed a lot over the past 10 years. So when we first started, we'd have these conversations and people would say, well, BP is a legally operating company and we all use what they sell, so what's the problem? They'd also say, where else can these cultural institutions get the money from? We're now at a place where a lot of these partnerships have been ended, and there have been other sources of funding that have been found. There's also much more understanding about the impacts of climate change, but also much more understanding about why these sponsorships are a problem. We always say that corporate sponsorship isn't philanthropy, it isn't a gift, it's a transaction, and something is always being sold. And I know in Norway there's this question of are we all kind of benefiting from the oil industry in the country as a whole? But there's something a bit different from taxation and this kind of money. The sponsorships allow a kind of the companies to have a cultural influence and a cultural power. So whether it's their logos on the wall, whether it's inviting their friends to go to an opera or this kind of thing, this is how they continue to occupy a really influential role in society. With our Royal Opera House, BP used to invite government ministers to go to the opera. And the trouble with that is there's no record of what they talked about, there's no transparency, and this is how they kind of keep themselves very close to government and make sure that they don't ever pass the kind of bold climate legislation that we know we need. And I think the things that created the change, so when we first started, there were a few people who would speak out, but it was the connections between the activism, the artists, archaeologists, architects, arts workers, really kind of coming together in an alliance and supporting each other. So we would do these kind of little creative protests, and we'd always kind of time them or plan them so that they didn't disrupt a play or a concert or something. They were an invitation to a conversation. And then over time, more people said, actually, we agree, what can we do to support you? And then we'd start having these kind of open letters signed by lots of kind of eminent artists and actors and so on that really built the pressure. But these things were in combination with each other as well. And then another significant part was the union that represented all the workers in these arts galleries and museums. They eventually came on board as well and passed a motion saying we support this campaign, because we started showing up to their strike actions as well and saying, you know, that the issues affecting the workers are very connected to the issues around corporate sponsorship. So that solidarity was really crucial.
Yeah.
So we would think about what's our strategy, but I think some of the things we did best were being responsive to what happened. So with the National Portrait Gallery, myself and my colleague, we've done a lot of work looking at what are the problems with BP, how can we pull that information together so it's accessible, you know, building all these connections. And then we had the opportunity to meet an artist who was quite a well-established artist, Gary Hume, and it just so happened that he had been asked to be a judge of the BP Portrait Award for that year. And he said, I'm not sure how I feel about this, can we meet up? So we met him and we talked, and he thought about it, and he said, okay, what can I do? And what followed was that on the night before they announced the prize, he spoke out publicly and said, I don't agree with BP sponsoring this prize anymore. So that really overshadowed the ceremony, and that really kind of undermined the positive boost that BP was trying to get from that association. Then what followed is other artists that knew him, that he'd worked with, his friends, his allies, they started to come on board, and there was another letter that followed of him with all the support from them as well, which built more pressure on the gallery. So it's often these things, one leading to another, or someone having a connection and us following it up, and us being the people who, when people say, this doesn't feel right, I'm not sure, can you convince me? What am I missing? And so we could be those people who could come in and say, we've got the information, let us support you. For a long time, Equinor, or back when it was Statoil, started sponsoring the Science Museum in London, and it chose to sponsor the space specifically for children and young people. So this space called the Wonder Lab, and they had their logo on the wall, they had a big launch event, lots of kind of famous people came along to it, and we sort of challenged it and we protested it and put pressure on it over the years. And what we kept doing is saying, look, Equinor is not in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. By you allowing them to sponsor this gallery, it gives the impression they're doing the right thing, that they're a good climate leader, that they're investing in renewables, when that really kind of, I guess, greenwashed them in a way to be associated with our science museum. And eventually, by sort of working with scientists and putting more and more pressure on the museum, they brought in a sustainability policy. And that said, if you're going to be a corporate sponsor of the museum, you need to make sure your business is aligned with 1.5 degrees, that target in the Paris Climate Agreement. And we kept the pressure up, kept going, and said, look, Equinor is not meeting this threshold anymore. And eventually that partnership came to an end, precisely because they're not in line with the Paris climate goals. And it was kind of gradually keeping this pressure on and saying, look, our governments have signed up to this agreement and said this is where we want to get to. These companies are not kind of pushing in the same direction. And we were really excited about that because we'd made this connection with Klimakultur, and to say, look, we've got rid of Equinor here for this reason. Can this help you? How do we make this happen in Norway now?